Okay, if you're down here, then you better have already done all of your examples for today, because here's the summary for this whole lesson about transformations. If you have a number and you're adding it to the outside of the function, when adding a constant outside the parentheses of a function, we have to be specific, because in that number 2, that's when you're adding or subtracting inside of the parentheses. It will shift just the y's up or down. And that's going to be called a vertical shift. When you add a constant outside of the parentheses of a function, it's going to shift only the y's up or down, which is called a vertical shift. So when you add, it's going to change the entire graph, and it's either going to lift it up or it's going to drag it down the entire line or shape, if you have a shape in geometry. Then what's the difference if you have x minus something inside the parentheses or x plus something inside the parentheses? Let's go back up. I think that was page 2. Yes. Whenever we did this, it was the x-intercept that changed. It wasn't necessarily the y's. The y's did change, but not by an easy to predict amount. The x's changed by a predictable amount. So when adding okay, so let's just put it right here. F of x plus 3. When adding, like in f of x plus 3, the graph shifts. A plus 3 will shift the graph left. When adding or when subtracting, as in f of x minus 3, the graph will shift to the right. When you do something inside the parentheses, a plus is going to shift the graph to the left, and a minus inside the parentheses is going to shift the graph to the right. And this is called a horizontal shift. All right, so we talked about the vertical shift, we've talked about the horizontal shift. Now we have this one, when multiplying by a scale factor. Outside of the parentheses, it's going to change the slope and the y-intercept. Or it will always change the slope and if b is not 0, if you don't have something that goes through the origin, and the examples from today, it did go through the origin, but if it doesn't go through the origin like it didn't yesterday, and if b is not 0, then the y-intercept will change too. They call this a vertical stretch. Lastly, if we multiply by a number and it's inside of the parentheses, I wouldn't call it a scale factor anymore, because this one is not going to change everything. It's only going to change what's inside of that parentheses, which is just x. When multiplying by a number inside the parentheses, or inside the function's parentheses, only the slope is changed. And not the y-intercept. The y-intercept will never be changed if we're multiplying inside of this parentheses. If you add and subtract, like in number 2 here, then yeah, because you're going to be shifting the entire graph to the left or to the right, that's going to change the y-intercept or the x-intercept. But if you just multiply in here, then that won't change the y-intercept. Oh, but it will change the x-intercept. But that's not as important. Okay, that's the end of today's notes. Just remember, inside the parentheses only changes the slope. Multiplying outside the parentheses changes everything by that factor. Adding or subtracting, if it happens inside the parentheses, it's going to shift the graph to the left or to the right. And if you add or subtract something outside of the parentheses, it's going to move it up and down, and it's just going to be exactly what that number is. If it's a +5, it'll move up 5. If it's a -5, it'll move down 5. Whereas if it's inside the parentheses, it's going to have kind of the opposite effect. A +3 moves it to the left, and a -3 moves it to the right. Okay, good luck. If you have any questions, please see me during my office hours between 2 and 3 o'clock.